Welcome to NewYorkBIOs Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Joe Landolina, CEO of Cressalon.
And I will say, Joe, it is wonderful to have you here. I'm glad that we actually just did the thing where we realized we met a few years ago. But I have known of you, and I have known of your company, and kind of the I would call it a meteoric rise up in New York. You've built something really fantastic, and these days are the ones that I liked all of these things, but really these days are the ones I really like because you've got a great story, you've got a really cool company, you've got something that I think is both an indelible and really important part of New York City's ecosystem. And we're going to talk about how you built it, where it's going to go, and everything. So we tend to start with an origin story, and I don't get to say this very often, but our story today begins way back on a winery in upstate New York. So why don't you take it away? Tell us a little bit about how you got where you are and where you came from.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so I had as with most things, Cressalon, as we'll talk today, a very unorthodox origin story in that my grandfather was an ex-executive at Hoffman LaRoche. And when he retired from the pharma world, he started a second career in the world of wine. And so he started one of the first wineries and vineyards up in the Hudson Valley in New York. And he learned lab safety in the 60s. And so that meant the day that I learned how to walk, he took me into the lab and said, this is a chemistry lab, mix some things together. Don't kill yourself, kid. And if you get hurt, don't tell your parents.
That's how all great scientists are born, right? That's the standard quote, basically.
Exactly. And so my parents were not quite as thrilled as I was to have. And so as I got older and continued to get myself in trouble with unfettered access to a lab, they cut me a deal, which was, please just go anywhere, do anything to learn lab safety the right way, and then you can come back and do real experimentation. But we want you to do it with the safety mindset, which
right.
was a great foresight on my parents' perspective.
That's good parenting right there. That's solid. I have the utmost respect for that. I think I would probably do something similar, but yeah. That's a good choice by the parents on that one.
Definitely. And so at the time, Columbia had this summer high school research program where high school students could get into a Columbia lab for the summer and do lab research. And so I had the opportunity to do that when I was 13 or 14 years old. And it was in one of the tissue engineering labs at Columbia. And I fell head over heels in love with this concept that you could take non-living material, plant-based scaffolding, and use that to influence a patient's cells. So specifically what that lab was working on was taking stem cells out of an athlete, using a plant-based scaffold to convert those stem cells into cartilage, and then reimplant those stem cells back into that patient. And
was this Gordana's lab?
No, it was Clark Hung's lab.
Oh, sure. Okay.
And so at the time, that was the very forefront of tissue engineering, and it made me fall head over heels in love with it. And so I decided to dedicate what I was screwing around with in my parents' winery to tissue engineering from that point forward. And so I came back home and I had this master plan to build a scaffold, and I was going to extract my own stem cells. And needless to say, nothing worked. I got nowhere near getting even stem cells, much less cartilage. But what I did end up with is this blend of two polymers that I was extracting out of algae. And I was so bad at running extractions that everything was failing. But I ended up with this material that was basically just a viscous gel that would stick to skin and wouldn't let go until I wanted it to. And so at the time, I was then 17 years old. I was an incoming freshman into NYU's engineering program. And I had this idea, which is, what if I took that material and injected it into an actively bleeding bullet wound, at least long enough so that you can stop a patient who's bleeding and get them to the next level of care.
So how did you get there? And I'll pause here for a second just to note that what you basically have here is either a supervillain or superhero origin story that didn't quite get there, right? Like the experiment didn't work the right way to make you into Spider-Man. So instead, the other path is like, well, I have this thing that might be useful. It's like this secondary tier where you don't get the Marvel movie, but you still actually contribute something good to science. So, okay. So you have this cool material. Why did you think about bleeding, right? Like, why did you think about a bullet wound? Like, how did that come about?
So it was front of mind, and my dad is on the side. He was a paramedic. He volunteered for the local EMS
There you
agency,
go.
and I knew that was a challenge. But more importantly, and
Mm.
maybe not more importantly, but more in closer proximity to me, I wanted to be a doctor. And so I was engineering was supposed to be a bit of a detour before medical school, and
Mhm.
this business plan competition that I entered with this idea wasn't intended to start a business. It was just intended to get some experience, get some, have a fun time, get a star on my resume that I could then use to get an internship and convert that into a better medical school, and so on and so forth. So really in at this point in the company's founding, that this was 2010, the intention was not to build a business around it. It was just it was an idea based on the field that I wanted to go into, and I wasn't even sure that it would work at that point. It was just a great concept that we entered into the business plan competition.
Well, listen, you're young enough that there's still time, right? I actually have friends that went to medical school after, older than you are now. So, all right, so you're at NYU. You found this. So how did you think about founding a company, and what was the initial part of that like, right? Because you're in college, and this is not. It's not like this is a business where you're selling t-shirts on the weekends, right? This is something that is it's not this kind of slush time type of thing where you catch as catch can, and you don't see really immediate reward from it. How did you think about that, right? Because that's not something that most college freshmen tend to have at the front of their mind. So how did that come about, and where did the money come from?
Sure. So in the very beginning, I was lucky through the NYU Stern competition. The teammate hunt there let me find my co-founder, Isaac Miller, who was then a student at the Stern School of Business, and so we started the company together. And Isaac and I had great opposing skill sets in a lot of ways. And so, but again, going through the competition, we were really just there for the experience. We weren't expecting anything more than a great experience. We weren't expecting to win at the engineering school and take second place at Stern.
Oh, so what was the competition?
And so this was so meaning, what were the competitive companies that were there?
No. Like, what was it? Just a little background on what the competition is.
So that was at the time, I believe, the first year of Stern's new tech venture competition.
Okay.
So that's now a $200,000 cash pool that the Berkeley Center at NYU puts on every single year. But at the time, it was in an earlier iteration of that, and so we ended up winning just shy of $10,000 out of the competition, which in the biotech world, I mean, standing here, we've now raised over $100 million in funding.
Right.
It's that pales in comparison.
But right. In the biotech world, we have just spent that $10,000 in the 9 minutes that we've been talking now. So
very likely.
Yeah.
But at the time, that was more money than I could have ever conceived of throwing at one idea. And so by the end of that competition, we realized that what we were doing was solving a really real problem that had a true need, and so we entered that competition as academics and just interested in getting experience. We exited that competition with the resolve for what became Crestalawn's mission of saving lives, and so from that point forward, things started to change. Slowly but surely. And I think that we were benefited by a bit of naivete, because when you're 17 years old, you don't realize that everyone tells you it's going to cost 10 years or 100
Right.
million and take 10 years. And you can, it's very easy to shrug it off when you've barely been on the planet for 10 years.
Right.
But at that point, we just started accelerating, and by my junior year or so, we had set up an experiment that proved the concept of what we were doing, and that video went viral.
Okay.
Had over 140 million views on it around the world, and that led to
we should post that.
Yeah, it was it was an old video. It was filmed on whatever it was, an iPhone 3 or something like that, in our dorm room at the time, which was an old. I went to a butcher. I got fresh blood. I got a steak, and we pumped the blood through the steak. We put the product on it, stopped it, and it just, I mean, just to age myself, it went viral on Tumblr. And then from there, it got picked up by a number of media outlets around the world, and that translated into me doing a TED Talk and a handful of TEDx's and some other top level media that had
26 seconds, right?
Exactly.
There it is. Oh, that's hosted panels. Hold on, I think everybody can see this one here. Yep, it is pumping the blood right through the steak.
Yep.
And look at that, that's awesome. That's very, very cool. Keep going.
And so basically that video was the launch pad. And it was funny because it was just a video that was filmed on an iPhone. But we ended up raising our first $4 million basically on that video alone. And that it came in through a number of mainly private angel investors that were both in the industry and not in the industry, but who were highly supportive of Crestlon and what it was. And so at that point, we were able to open up our first site. And so in 2013, we opened up a building in Park Slope. And that building we found on Craigslist, of all places. It was an old 1930s schoolhouse. We built everything ourselves, and then we got hit with one of the biggest challenges that we faced as an organization, which took us nearly a decade to solve, which was not building the product, but building the manufacturing for the product. It turned out that no one could do this because it's basically, our product is like the viscosity of hummus, but it needs to be made like
it's funny. I read about that, and really having not necessarily seen it, and the gel gives it away as a gel, but like once you read that the product has the consistency of hummus, all you can think about is spreading hummus onto basically hemorrhaging wounds, which I don't know if anyone in the audience is doing that right now, but it's actually a really kind of unsettling thing. Like you've got the Sabra hummus and you're spreading it on the thing. And this is the image that I went to sleep with last night. And it's honestly, it's not, it's not sheep jumping over a fence. It's a thing. And it's funny, you don't really think so much about the bleeding stopping, but you're putting hummus in an open wound. That's really gross. But since this is not hummus and it's not, on the shelves at Westside Market, I think it's fine. I actually still have the video going over here because it just repeats. It's amazing. So, okay, so you take this video and it goes viral, right? So I actually want to hear about, was there this kind of moment where you said, well, this is like, we need to take this to people and get money and I want, how did you find this? Because I'm guessing you didn't already have like a list of the top, venture folks or whatever. Like, how did you network into those investors, and how did you kind of choose who you wanted to bring into the fold, right? Because that's actually when you have the choice, right? That's actually a really important choice in terms of who you bring on in terms of really money.
So that's something I need to credit Isaac for primarily there, which is that on one hand, we were very lucky. We had over 2,500 investors reach out to us directly, trying to invest in the business, and so we hired a full-time employee whose only job it was to vet investors, and we ended up making a short list. We interviewed the short list, and we insisted that any investor that came into the business at that stage, we wanted to have a personal relationship with them. We wanted to understand what their motivations were for investing in Crestlon, and we also wanted to build a cohort of investors that were additive to the stage of the business that we were in. And so at that time, we built a really great group of investors. And so in fact, one of the more unorthodox things when we talk about that $100+ million that we've raised. Right. The majority of that $100 million has been reinvestment from those angel investors.
Wow!
And so, yes, we have some VCs in. We've partnered with a large investment bank in later years in order to help us manage all of this. And but I mean, maybe by dumb luck, because we didn't really know much at the time as we were putting it together, but through that process of making sure that we built those personal relationships, those investors to support us over the better part of a decade.
I mean, there's some luck involved, but like it's not lucky if you run a good process. Like just listening to what you're talking about, that was really smart. right? You're talking about bringing people in early. You did a lot of things to not make the mistake that a lot of people point to, which is be careful about who you bring early. You're basically the example case for the way that you should do it, right? Because earlier, how many were there?
So in the beginning, we had about 25 or 30
Okay.
investors that came
And that's a
together.
big group. That's a
It's a
big
big
group.
group of investors.
Right. But now you're basically talking about, the going back to that group, you've been able to basically curate this group. You understand what their motivations are. You theoretically could screen out, any bad actors, but you've really done it the way that it's supposed to be done. You've obviously performed well enough that you could go back to them for subsequent rounds. I imagine you stepped up valuations and things as you did that. But you got to kind of have those conversations with people who were on your own terms. So out of 25, right? Out of 25, were there any, what was your hit rate out of 25? Did you miss any of them? Were there any that were, more difficult than you thought they were going to be? The answer to that question has to be yes, right? There's no way that you pick 25 absolute saints who are just really happy to be there.
So what I'll say is we were really lucky, right? And so you get a cast of personalities.
Yes.
When you have, because today we have a lot more than 25 investors,
I would imagine, yeah.
And so it runs the gamut. But all of our investors, above all else, believe wholeheartedly in the mission, and that was our selection criteria, which that they understand that what we're doing here is to save lives, and that it may take longer than it does, and we may not always be happy in doing that, but by and large, we have a great group of investors.
Mm-hmm. So you said early on, one of the hardest things to do was to set up the actual manufacturing, right? And I imagine your initial stage, I imagine there's probably some things where you're messing around with formulation or whatever. You got to get the form factor right. You have to do some of that. But how much early on was, changes in the actual chemistry, or how much did you just take the first thing you made and use it, right? Because then we get to how much of it can you actually make.
Sure. So what I'll say is that I look at Cressilon in phases, right?
Okay.
And so from 2010 to 2014, that was a process of taking this formula, right? And so we're very creative on a number of things, but naming products and companies is not one of our fortes. And so we have two ingredients, we call them A and B.
Mm-hmm.
And so Vetagel, our product, is A plus B and water. And we knew what the ratios were, but looking at purification of this, right, with any natural material, you get this bell curve of material properties.
Yeah.
So we started with this material that would 10% of the time do something that would absolutely blow everyone's minds, and 90% of the time it would do nothing at all, and we had no idea why. And that was the idea that I found, because it was a messy extraction, right? So we knew that something we were doing, even if we replicated it, 1 out of 10 times we were getting it bang on, and 9 out of 10 times we were doing something wrong. We didn't know what even the levers were to pull, and so
that's a rather sharp bell curve, but okay.
Exactly. And so I mean, the challenge with this product is that it's very simple. The ingredients are very simple, but if you get the application wrong, if you get the mixing or the blending just the wrong way, it does nothing. It looks the same, but it does nothing. And so that's great for us from a competitive advantage perspective. It was not fun for the first 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
Development, because we were just doing knockout studies, which are, changing one variable, seeing what would happen. Does it get better? Does it get worse? Does nothing change? And then we can figure out how to hone the formulation. And so by 2015, we ended up with a product that worked every time, and where we found at least the big pieces of what we needed to do. And we had a manufacturing plant that could do it, but we realized for a number of reasons, and I don't want to necessarily drone on too long about all of those challenges, but it would have been irresponsible to have launched in 15, because we were building it. We had a manufacturing plant that was in an old 1930s schoolhouse that was a 10-foot by 10-foot clean room. And we had orders from 15% of the US animal health market.
Wow.
And I realized that we couldn't do it that way. And so we had to go back on board. And so from 2016 to 2020, it was building scale in the business pre-launch. And that was very unorthodox, in that we had to effectively front load all of the investment into a human level manufacturing plant that's fully CGMP. And so Cressilon operates today out of 33,000 square feet of aseptic production. It is the only one of its kind here in the 5 boroughs since Pfizer shut down in the early 2000s. And that being said, it took us another 4 years and quite a bit of investment and patience from our existing investors in order to get through that.
I could imagine this conversation, right? Like you said, you have orders from 15% of the entire veterinary market, which, I don't know how big it is, but it's 15% is probably a decent enough chunk where that's money in the door. And as an angel investor, you like to see that. And you basically had to have the conversation where we're going to forego this and we're going to do it right. And we're going to actually work to get the process right. And then we're going to do it right. And that is, I imagine there's a split of your investors, some of whom got that and some of whom probably didn't. Right. And I imagine it was not all sunny times.
It was not. It was a very trying time, because one of the challenges with open fill aseptic processing is that if you make a change, it's a 14-day test to see if that change has messed up the process.
Right.
So your ability to iterate and innovate is limited in these 2-week tranches. And so you can try to change a bunch of things at once, but if it goes wrong, then you don't know what happened. Or you can change one at a time in serial, and it ends up stretching out your timelines. And one thing that I learned is that there's a certain bacteria that likes to live only in Brooklyn, that only shows up on day 15 of this test. And so meaning that we really need all 14 days of this test. And so it was a harrowing time, but we got through it, right? And I can take no credit for it. It was all my team and the team that we put together and built that had experience in going through this. But the problem was that no one had done this before, right? That this is what I can't understate is how much innovation had to go into that 4-year period of time, because it wasn't just making the product, it was designing the machinery from scratch, it was designing the processes, the assays, because you can't take something off the shelf. And that was one of the reasons why I pulled the plug in 2015, was that we were outsourcing to contract labs and they were giving us false negatives, meaning they were telling us things were clean when they were not clean. And that's not necessarily their fault. But as a kid, you tend to, or as someone with less experience in this industry, you tend to trust the labs that work for some of the largest companies that are out there. That FDA filings
they told you what the data is and you believe it, right? Which is what you paid them to do.
But when you have a novel product, you realize very quickly that you can't trust anything. You have to build it all yourself. And so that's why, from 2015, Cressilon of 2015 was destined to be a virtual company, meaning outsource as much as possible. Today's Cressilon is a vertical company. We build as much, we own as much as we possibly can, because I have one rule as a CEO, which is I like to sleep at night. Right? I like to know that we're not taking unnecessary risks that can put a patient or a clinician at risk. And the only way that we do that is by bringing in the right people, giving them the right resources, and controlling the things that need to be controlled.
Yep. All right, so that is we can call that your iterative phase, which really, if we're messing around with origin stories, right? We've already got the different version of the universe of the superhero origin story, and now you've basically got the virtuous version of Breaking Bad here, right? Like you had your lab in the Winnebago, and then you moved it to the thing, and you found your process, and instead of meth, you have something that'll stop, hemorrhaging gunshot wounds, which again is like the alternate universe from where Breaking Bad could have gone. It's really kind of through the looking glass on that one. So now that you make this decision, you've got your process, and now you've got 33,000 square feet. And now instead of a chemistry challenge, you have a commercial challenge, right? Now you have to actually figure out how to sell this to people, how to actually put manufacturing processes in place. And you started with a veterinary market, right?
Exactly.
So what is the regulatory filing like for a product like this for the veterinary market? Because I imagine it's not nothing, but I also imagine it's not it's not the same as humans.
So it's what's interesting is that veterinary device as a category is in a there are very few specific regulations for vet device, and so the way that Cressalon interpreted the vet device regulations was that we ended up taking an overkill approach, and so when you look at the FDA, the main tenets of the FDA, I mean, going back to Upton Sinclair, right, is that you can't misbrand and you can't have adulterated product, and so in in those two veins, we have a claim of sterility on our label, which is something that we take very seriously. But there were no vet device sterility regulations on the books. And so what we did is we adopted the human regulations. And so that in a way was above and beyond, but we ran the process internally with a QMS as if we were building a human product for all intents and purposes. And that gets into the vein of ensuring that I can sleep at night, because we want to know that we have a robust quality system. But again, one of the main benefits of that is that we don't have to build two systems. And so we, from that point forward, now as we start entering the human market, which I'm sure we'll talk about, right?
Yep.
We don't really need to redo a lot of legwork. We've done the hard part, the heavy lifting up front, and from that point forward, right? It meant that it was a painful couple of years, but in that time where we kept having 2 weeks of waiting for our microbiologists to come back and tell us whether or not we were doing things the right way or not, we could spend that time building up a quality system that was competitive at a human level.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And that's, honestly, you think about it, it's got to be the right approach, right? When you're not entirely sure where the regulations are, an overkill approach is usually the right thing to do. And I imagine the regulatory bodies tend to like that too. It's not all that indifferent from kind of the first wave of digital therapeutics companies that said, we are going to run this exactly like a pharmaceutical clinical trial, same outlet, same outcomes, same data, same et cetera. And ultimately, when you're dealing with regulations, if you give them the things that they are used to seeing or that they can find precedent for, that's usually a very good way of staying in their good graces, right? Because there's always, you can always find reviewer number 2 that really wishes you had done one thing that you didn't.
Always.
Okay. So you are now serving the veterinary market. You have gone back to your investors a couple of times who have, shown the actual patients of, the angel that is associated with their names. And, now, so what year does that bring us to now? Where are we now?
So we chose to launch.
Are we at now?
So we are in 2020 when we launched into the veterinary market, and then which was the best time to launch into animal health when no one can see
right
in person on a product that needs physical training,
and
then from that point forward, so we had a fairly slow start in 2020, but as things started to open back up in 2021, we really hit the ground running, and so today. And we have Vetigel in about 30 countries around the world. We've saved over 45 lives on that product line, and there's still quite a bit of growth because that in the U.S. we only had 5 sales reps of our own, and so we just opened up into national level distribution that will have about 660 reps carrying Vetigel from this point forward, and so that there's a lot more growth to be seen in that market here, even just in the United States, and we're excited about that because in that market, the average Vetigel customer is not converting from a competitor. They're converting from what we lovingly call in Brooklyn pressure and a prayer, when it's paying someone to stick their finger on a bleed and wait until it stops, and so. To be able to make that conversion, there's a reason why they're not using competitive products, and usually it's economic sensitivity. And so what we're finding is that it's not the ability to stop bleeding quickly that's interesting, and it opens the doors. Sure, it gets you appointments with the clinician, but most importantly, it shortens the time that you keep a patient on the operating table. And so that means that you can take a 6-hour surgery and turn it into a 4-hour surgery just by stopping bleeding more quickly. And as a result, that means that you lower the cost of anesthesia. So what we find is that if you crack open a syringe of Betadgel, you're saving at least the cost of that syringe of Betadgel just by
Right.
using the product, because you're saving more in the anesthesia cost alone than you are in the cost of the hemostatic, but you recover that patient faster. And so now you're finding that there are patients that couldn't even take the risk of being put under the knife for certain procedures that can
Right.
now not only have those procedures, but they can be sent home same day because of lowered risk of complication. And so that's in animal health. I mean, we see use case from neurosurgery and spine surgery through to massive trauma and everything in between. And so it runs the gamut. So as we start to transition into the human space, it gives us a real clinical data set that we know that we can see a real economic benefit. And again, the economics or the economic sensitivity in animal health, because it's a cash business. I mean, the last I checked, healthcare enrollment for insurance in the U.S. is only 4% in the animal health market, meaning the vast majority of that market is a cash market, as opposed to the human health market, which is obviously payer driven.
Yeah.
And so to not
the same.
Not to understate, and so it's a very different market. And so if we could have success there, it's a great proof of concept for what's to come in the human space.
No, that's excellent. I mean, you can put any analogy on it that you want, but it's really, you think about the advent of the leaf blower, and instead of spending all day raking leaves in your yard, you're just drastically reducing the time to do something. So it's like, it's the tool, really. It's the tool that makes the procedure go faster, more efficiently, lower risk, et cetera. And honestly, I think there are a few categories of people in the world that appreciate that more than surgeons, right? Surgeons love their tools, trust their tools, know their tools in and out, and know what they can do, and they rely on them. So a product like that's going to be used by surgeons and taken up by surgeons, you're probably in a really good spot, especially, stopping bleeding in a dog isn't all that much different than stopping bleeding in a human, and they'll get that.
Exactly, and that's one of the benefits, which is that if you can, if you can stop a dog spine from bleeding, you can very likely stop a human spine from bleeding.
Right. So let's transition a little bit here, because in this kind of transition point, one of the things that you did is you actually went out and raised I don't know if they called it a Series A, right? But you raised a $25 million round from institutional investors outside of angel investors. So how did that come together, and what was the decision process like to kind of go outside the proverbial family, as it were?
So one of the benefits of having repeat angel investors is that we get to build deep relationships. We get to count on support from the same people over and over again. But the problem is that individuals have limited funds.
Yes.
And so there comes a time when no matter how excited your investors are, they just can't continue to support the company at the level that it needs to be supported at. And so we needed to broaden the pool. And so what I'll say is that we worked with Paulson, which is an investment bank based here in New York, and they helped us. But again, even though Paulson themselves are an institution, right? Their funds of capital, the sources of capital, are primarily coming from retail investors. And so what's interesting is even the investor mix that we're finding through that group of investors, it fit in line almost identically with the investors that Crestline had raised from prior to this. And so that meant that in this cohort of investors, we were getting customers of ours investing. So these were top vet surgeons, top human surgeons. They were individuals who were innately interested and invested, both metaphorically and literally, in the success of the business. And so, I mean, as an example, we're now preparing to launch our a major trauma product under the brand Trauma Gel. That's pending FDA clearance at this point, but we intend to launch that next year.
You keep saying you're not good at naming stuff. I think you're really good at naming stuff. That's perfect. Like, well, honestly,
tell that to my trademark attorney.
But that's fine. No, really, honestly, it's one of these things where you know, you can say it, it's reasonably obvious what it does. Like, I think the general rule on, any sort of biotech product is that if it doesn't sound, it can even sound dumb if it works, right? So if it even is marginally close to okay and it works, you've got something there. And honestly, trauma gel, what is it? It's a gel that helps with trauma. Boom, there you go. Like, I don't understand. Have your trademark guy call me. You're going to be all right.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the benefit on trauma gel is that I can call up my investors. I have investors. I have a good number of them that are trauma surgeons themselves or emergency physicians, and we can call them up and say, "Listen, I need you to be brutally honest. Come play with this product. You tell me what you like about it, but most importantly, tell us what you hate about it. What needs to change." And it just, I mean, that ability to get access through our investor base to the end user in a friendly way, where, I mean, no one will be brutally honest with you than someone who has their own personal dollars at stake in the outcome of that product.
Right.
So it's a great way to get access into the market early. And so, I mean, even early in the development of this product, right, we were helped incredibly well by our investors who are also practicing physicians.
Yep. So do you ever get to a point where somebody comes up with a suggestion you think is really good, but is actually a pretty significant change to how you would do it, right? I mean, there's various things that you can do, and there's probably some suggestions that are actually really good, but would involve a lot on your part in terms of actually implementing those suggestions, right? So does that ever happen? And do you have anything that goes into like a multi-generational, plan for thing? I also imagine from an investment standpoint, they kind of viscerally understand, like, okay, this is the thing that I don't like, and you say, well, that's a 2-year change to what we do, right? I think that probably resonates pretty strongly with them.
So, I mean, as an engineer, right, that's the fun in all of this, right?
Yeah.
I'm a believer that a one product company isn't quite a company, and so we need to be constantly innovating. Otherwise, a product that's revolutionary and game changing today won't be revolutionary and game changing in 5 or 10 years, and so
Right.
we have to stay ahead of the curve. And so, even to use trauma gel as an example, right, there is a pipeline of innovation that's happening along that product, and it's not even launched yet.
Yeah. No, that's real. So when you got when this round came together, right? How did you think about sizing? I mean, does this basically take you to a full-blown commercial organization? Is that basically what this round does for you?
So again, one other thing that I'm terrible at naming are rounds, because I'm always a pessimist when we begin, and then it turns out that the SEC doesn't allow you to rename rounds once they've been named and marketed to investors, and so instead of having a Series B, I just kept adding a dash number to our Series A, and so that 25 million was in a Series A-4.
Okay.
Probably should have been a B-1 or B-2 or something like that, but it doesn't really matter as long as the
in the grand scheme of things, I think the number of people that matters to is pretty minimal.
But for all intents and purposes, yes. I mean, so that funding has been used and will be used to bring us into a full commercial organization. So today,
that's exciting.
Crestalon is GP positive. We're not yet EBITDA positive, and so what that means is that we're still heavily investing in our human product launches, so that haven't happened yet. And so as we get into next year and beyond, we're looking forward to going fully in the green.
That's great. So how many people do you have at the company now?
We have about 70 employees.
Okay, that's fantastic. And you're still in Brooklyn. I looked up the address, but I think Google might still have your address under the old schoolhouse one. So you said what, 33,000 square feet in Brooklyn?
Exactly. So we actually today we have 2 buildings. We still
Okay.
have the schoolhouse, which is just R&D and corporate offices.
Got it. And
then we have our site down in Industry City, which is just manufacturing.
Okay. All right. Can we talk a little bit about? So I mean, this has got to be just you're such a great story for New York City, right? This is kind of this is genuinely a born and bred. I'll call you a success story because most people don't get to the point that you are now. So can we talk a little bit about how Kind of the city has been helpful. I think, I think Sue Rosenthal and her team do a really great job. And, obviously this is the kind of business that they'd like to support for so many reasons, not only because you really kind of represent the best of really the innovation economy on one hand, but you also have the manufacturing jobs, you have all sorts of, economic development things. You check every single box for the EDC to love you.
Yeah, we've been very lucky. I mean, New York is a community that really wants biotech, and I mean, for Crestalon to be the only manufacturer of this type here, it's been helpful from a talent acquisition perspective. I mean, if you're an engineer and you graduate from one of the top schools that we have here in New York, and you want to stay in the city and work in a full scale plant, you have exactly one option, or almost exactly one option, and that leads to, if we open an entry level position, we get over 800 applicants into each position. So even through COVID, when it was very difficult to hire and retain, we've had very limited turnover and very great applicant volume, at least in the entry level positions. It's not quite there yet because unfortunately New York doesn't yet have a fully rounded or a well-rounded biotech community yet, because most companies or businesses that are operating here are pre-commercial, and so as a result, and don't do the manufacturing here.
Right. I like to think that we have a bimodal challenge, right? We have, a peak of a bunch of, very active smaller companies, and then we have another peak of some very active large companies, and it's that middle that needs to be filled in, and I'm hoping is filled in as, some of these companies that have been created over the last few years manage to not only grow up to good outcomes, but manage to grow up to good outcomes and stay here and grow, which is actually a tall order, right? So in one of the things that I put on here that we can talk a little bit about is, when it is basically the concept of an exit, right? And you're in an interesting position where, you are now basically, going to push into the commercial market. Most biotech companies never get there, right? Most biotech companies are bought and sold off before they get anywhere, usually at clinical proof of concept, or certainly before commercialization. So what does that concept look like with your investors, right? Because so how should I phrase this? Biotech companies work very well in looking at new therapeutic products that they can slot into either their R&D portfolio or their commercial portfolio. Your product is not that, right? It's a little bit different. And, so what does it look like for you to think about the commercial landscape and where you sit, and how do you have that conversation with your investors about, getting their money back? Because the IPO window is kind of closed, right? The public markets are pretty tepid and unappealing at the moment. What does that conversation look like?
Sure. I think that two things. So the first of which is the niche of biosurgery, which is where our products fit in, right? Which are things like hemostatics and sealants and others that are designed to help the surgeon do surgery better, is a very active M&A space.
Okay.
But what's interesting about it is that Crestalon is not a pure play business, right? And so we have three major channels, or three major verticals, right? We have animal health, we have trauma care, and we have surgery. And the acquirers in each of those channels have limited interest in the other two channels, which is a unique thing for Crestalon. But out of that is born optionality. And so I think that's one of the interesting pieces for our investors at this stage, which is that our strategy has always been grow Crestalon like we're going to become a large company. And there are lots of examples of businesses that took a star product or a key product and built that into a cornerstone of a larger portfolio offering, and use that as a jumping off point to grow and then leverage the public markets from that point forward, or other private sources of capital, right? But on the flip side, right, Crestalon retains the ability to either sell its entirety to a single buyer that's interested in taking over the portfolio, or sell it piece by piece into the market. And so at this point, it's too early to say what that's going to look like. But the point is that we've built a verticalized, self-sustaining business where we can grow and will be profitable shortly. And we can sustain ourselves through that, and we can get real scale with limited additional capital. And so that is well, it's an interesting place to be because it gives us optionality in ways that we can provide liquidity and returns back to our investors. But also, it's one of the things where it's key that our investors don't have LPs that are knocking on their doors, waiting for and trying.
That's actually a big deal. That's a big. You don't have an M&A clock right now, right? Your investment is not proverbially long in the tooth. You do have investors that have been very patient with you for a long time, which is fantastic. But you're not in a spot where you are basically going to be forced to sell at the first inkling of interest, right? You're not going to be forced to sell for a 3x when people can see the actual the growth that you can get to, right? And we haven't even talked about ex-US markets or anything, right? Like we have, I imagine, the world is your proverbial oyster here in terms of, what you can do from a product standpoint, because, people bleed in other countries too. So that's actually really interesting as well. There's probably some additional regulatory stuff that you have to do that probably gets a little bit more complex. But like you said, you're in an era now where you can now do, smart strategic growth, where you're looking at, you're looking at returns to the bottom line rather than looking at, making progress or getting interest from potential acquirers, which is really a preferential state to be in.
Exactly.
One of the things we didn't bring up, now that we're talking about kind of multi-pronged strategy, in addition to closing this round, you put together a really interesting collaboration with Walter Reed around, of all things, traumatic brain injury.
That's something that's super exciting for a number of reasons. And for me, again, the engineer in me loves this primarily because this is the first collaboration that Crescent has done that is not specifically for hemostasis. And so let me explain what this is. So there's a subset of traumatic brain injury called penetrating ballistic like brain injury. And so this is when something like a bullet or a piece of shrapnel enters the brain and creates a penetrating wound to the brain. There's a very low survival rate to that type of injury, and there's no standard of care to treat that type of injury today. So that means that if you have a patient or if there's a casualty with that type of injury, it's very likely that patient is going to die, and there's nothing, unfortunately, that can be done to treat that.
Right.
It turns out is that the injury is not really lethal from the onset, right? It's not the initial injury. It's about the swelling of the brain over time, and
yes,
the structure itself will collapse. And so Walter Reed came to us and asked us a simple question, which is that if you guys work as a scaffold, and that scaffold can hold back pressure but is malleable, why not, or would it work to be able to stabilize the brain? And so we don't really care about the bleeding as much as just holding the brain in place while you can transport that patient to the next level of care. So we said we have no idea what we've never tried that, obviously,
right.
But let's try to put a collaboration together for it. And so we signed a CRADA, which is a collaborative research agreement with Walter Reed. And unfortunately, I can't talk too much about what those results are. But
that's understandable. Yeah,
is that I have pilot results back, and they look incredibly promising. And
that's
so,
fantastic.
It's exciting because it will, and it just again shows the type of potential on this platform, where it's not just applicable to hemostasis, but in the future, this can be something that can be useful across many other indications that today have absolutely nothing to solve those problems.
Right. You literally have you have this solution that is probably applicable to so many problems beyond what you've thought of, that there are probably going to be people that come out of the woodwork and say, hey, could we use it for this? And medicine is it's one of the great things about medicine is that the folks that we have that are doctors, surgeons, trauma docs, etc., they sit there and they look at what's the thing that I can do to help these patients, right? And they actually have a very good mind for, well, what if I could do this, right? It's like, well, if I could do this, then then these outcomes get better, and they get really, really intrigued when they say, "Ooh, this might let me do the thing that will, save another 30% of my patients." And it's something that doctors in a lot of ways don't get enough credit for, but it's something that's really great about people that sit there and spend most of their days thinking about, how can I help my patients more, right? So, all right, you're at this exciting spot. You've got 70 people. You've got all of you've got all of these things going on. So, honestly, how do you sleep at night? What are the things that do kind of keep you up, and what are the things that you spend most of your time thinking about as your company grows? Because you're in this privileged position, right? You're in a position that very few people get to be in. You're, we haven't even touched on the fact that like and I don't mean this. This is really not meant to be insulting in any way. You're not a typical CEO story, right? And so, what are some of the things that, I don't know, that you do differently, that you think about, et cetera? How do you just think about running your company every day? And what are the things that, are kind of on your mind as the company's going to grow?
And at this point, it's really all about team, right? So the engineer in me, right? I always, my team will probably not agree with you on this, right? But technical challenges are iterative, right? I can say with confidence that there are few, if any, technical problems that are not solvable by the team that we've put together. It's just a matter of time and money, and thankfully we've had enough of both in order to do what we needed to do. At this point, though, we know the product just works. So we have over 45,000 lives saved in animals, and that's everything from gunshot wounds to brain surgery to some of the most complicated procedures. And so this product is saving lives every single day. I mean, it's very likely that over the course of this conversation, a handful of lives were saved with our product somewhere in the world. And so that means that if Cressilon doesn't work out, if there's an issue here, it's not because of the technology. It's not a technical problem that got in the way. It's an execution problem that got in the way. And so most of my time today is dedicated on team, making sure we have the right people in place, making sure that they're resourced properly, and that we're thinking properly about our market access, because there's a really interesting and there's a book by a guy by the name of Joshua Dick, who the book is entitled "Grow Like a Lobster," where it says that like a lobster does, the lobster will grow until it's so big for its shell that it busts out of its shell and it becomes this little tiny, soft, very vulnerable creature. But you become most vulnerable while you're in the stages of most rapid growth, and then you can build a shell when you stabilize off. And so what I always tell my team is that in these periods of rapid growth, you end up in a situation where you're most vulnerable because you're sticking your neck out and you're changing things. And so one of the fears that we have, one of the things that does keep me up at night, is making sure that we're balancing that properly, because we've built something great here at Cressilon, and we have a lot of growth to come. And growth is never easy. It's helpful that we have a product that just works. And frankly, it surprises me every single day and how amazingly the product can work in the hands of trained clinicians. But we can't squander that, and with that comes a responsibility for good stewardship of the product. And it's about making sure that we're keeping our team active and not resting on our laurels.
Yeah, well, I think that's a fantastic motive, right? I mean, we hear over and over again about how, people invest in the team, and people invest in the team, and people invest in the team. And I think what you've just said is really exemplary here. Like, you've got a product, the product that you have is not going to change in between now and whatever, unless you do something drastic. And the thing that's going to make it successful is going to be the people that you put around you, right? And you're in this position now. I imagine New York City is a pretty great place to find those people.
It really is. I mean, with anything, we always have our challenges, but New York is I mean, I'm a New Yorker myself. I love this city. It's one of the reasons why Cressalon is still here, because you really, I always say this: in order to grow large as a biotech company in New York, it's not necessarily the incentives that keep you here. It's you have to want to be here,
Yeah.
because it's you have to continue to invest every single day and then make that active decision to opt in. But it's a great city with a great amount of resources.
Yeah, I have heard that. I've heard that line before by people who have grown things here, and it was reiterated over and over again from a couple of companies that was, we could have gone somewhere else, but the people that we had at the, we loved it here, and the people that we had at the company loved it here, and the people that we hired loved it here and wanted to be here. And I think that's a differentiating factor, right? Like there are, you can look at the statistics around, which cities and which bioclusters are growing and who's doing this. But, really underlying all that is if you think about why people grow in a particular place, why they set up in a particular place, and ultimately why they stay in a particular place. A lot of the time it's because not only the core team, but most of the team really wants to be there and likes to be there. And I think, culturally, that's a huge advantage. Right, it's a big advantage for the region, and we just happen to be lucky enough to to live and work in one of the greatest cities in the world. So, that's actually really great to hear. I love that it's part of the strategy. I hope that everybody comes to work for you, never really wants the company to move anywhere else. So we only have a couple of minutes left. And before we actually go, I do want to actually, what is the name of your grandfather's winery?
It's called Baldwin Winery.
All right. Well, at the very least, we should give a plug to your grandfather here for something that basically for the place that it all started. If you do find yourself in Pine Bush, New York, it's certainly someplace that you can go. So, okay, we've got about 3 minutes left. Usually we give people this time to tell us a little bit about the future. We've spent a decent amount of time talking about the company's future, but talk to us a little bit about something that you see on the horizon that you think is important to you that we kind of haven't touched already. Just give us a little perspective, like either on how do you keep your team motivated, or how are you going to make everybody around you want to really kind of pursue the same kind of goals you're going to want to pursue?
Sure. It's well, I mean, from a perspective, something that I see on the horizon, right, that I'm most excited about, right, is understanding, right, that a real biotech community in New York needs to be fully well-rounded, right, and that's not just scientists and engineers and commercial people. It also includes technicians. It includes warehouse personnel. It includes a full range of blue collar and white collar workers that need to be developed and hired from our local communities. So a lot of what we've been trying to do is build that within our local communities, right? And we do that through internship programs for students. But we also do that through career development programs within our community, within Sunset Park or other areas of the city. And so that's something that we're looking forward to. And unfortunately, today, Cressalon is one of the few biotechs that is hiring from that pool. So it's not terribly well developed today. But that also means that maybe not great for me, but the candidate pools that we develop today will be able to be used by the companies of tomorrow. And so that's going to be a really good thing for New York, because it's bringing skilled labor here. And in fact, I have a number of employees that were either when they came to New York, they were unable to find well-paying positions with the skill sets that they came with, and then they found their way to Cressalon, or individuals that were commuting further out into Jersey or onto Long Island, but living in Brooklyn or living in other areas of the city that can find careers here at Cressalon. And so that's something I'm very excited about, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that develops.
I would agree with you there, and honestly, I think the only way to get it there is for people to blaze the path to go there, and you happen to be doing that. I think I agree with you. That's tremendously important. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. I hope we get to see each other in person soon. But this has really been a great hour. I'm just super excited about what you've built, and really psyched to see you guys grow. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Everybody else, I hope you have a wonderful day, and see you soon. Thanks, Joe.
Yes, thank you so much. Take care, Derek.